The first year I ever put a Bluebird nest box up, I thought it was just a matter of putting the box up somewhere and then good and wonderful things would come. I did a little bit of research and I bought a nest box that was built according to the North American Bluebird Society standards. And then I got like a wooden pole and I staked that in the ground and I screwed the box into that. And that right there, that wooden pole, that's a no-no. I even saw a lot of articles about properly mounting nest boxes to metal poles and having a baffle of some kind, but I didn't have a lot of money starting out and I just didn't heed the warnings when I first started. I didn't think it was that important. I really thought too that people were just overthinking things. At the same time, a lot of the reason I wanted to put that Bluebird nest box out in the first place is because I read bluebirds needed a lot of help. They had declined decades ago, and while things right now are fairly stable for eastern bluebirds, that stability is a result of proper care by us. So when starting out, I did a lot of things wrong, and I thought what I'd do is I pass some of the things that I either wish I had known when starting out, or I wish I had taken seriously, or just things I never expected, things I really enjoyed when starting out. Getting into bluebirds is more than a hobby. Bluebirds need our help. The reality is that habitat loss, invasive species, and other environmental pressures are making it incredibly difficult for many native birds to thrive. Also, while eastern bluebird populations have become a little more stable, according to the American Bird Conservancy, the mountain and western bluebird populations are still declining. So what that means when starting out is you not only want to take the advice seriously about properly mounting and getting a real species-specific nest box, not a birdhouse, mounting that on a pole with a stovepipe baffle, but you also need to monitor these nest boxes. It's not set it and forget it. It's actually okay to open these boxes and look inside every few days. And now it's even easier if you mount a nest box camera inside the box. The Nest Watch website has a great protocol for monitoring bird nests, and I'll link that in the description for you. There will be tons of resources for you. One really important note about monitoring is that once your baby bluebirds are about 12 days old, don't open the box to monitor. This could lead to early or premature fledging. Even if you have one of those nest boxes where there's a plexiglass window and it's kind of a barrier there, don't do it, because they could still jump out of that exit hole in fear. And yeah, you can put them back in. The whole thing about birds smelling the scent of people and abandoning their young, that's a myth. But the problem is premature fledging can cause wing injury, bone breaks, and then they're also more likely to jump early again. The purpose, though, of monitoring nest boxes is to know whether or not you've got eggs in there in the first place, what kind of eggs, what kind of nest you even have based on the material and the structure. You're able to check the health of the nestlings this way. Are they chatty and hungry, or are they lethargic? Are there parasites like blowfly larvae attached to them? Monitoring also tells you about predator events and fatal competition events, which I'll get into pretty soon here. But another really fun upside to monitoring, besides just seeing these babies grow, is that you can guess when the fledge window is and then watch your baby bluebirds or chickadees or tree swallows take their first flight out of that nest box. I just mentioned predator events. I have a video that highlights some common nest box predators, but snakes, raccoons, squirrels, even other birds can threaten the nest box. And something really important to keep in mind when it comes to bluebirds or any species that nest in nest boxes is once something reaches into the nest box, there is no escape. Open nesting birds like robins, cardinals, and finches, at least when they're sitting on their nest, if they sense a predator or a threat, they can fly out, fly away in any direction. The babies or eggs may not survive, but the healthy mother bird did, and they'll usually attempt another nest. But for cavity nesting birds, so these are the birds that nest in nest boxes or tree holes, there's nowhere for them to go once something reaches in the box. They're completely trapped inside. That's why predator protection is so important for these birds. So what do? One of the best ways to protect them is a stovepipe baffle. You want one that's at least 8 inches in diameter by 24 inches tall. I have these available on the Nest Hollow site too. That type of baffle will provide some decent protection. Of course, taller baffles are becoming more and more recommended. So a baffle that's 60 inches tall or 5 feet provides better protection from those larger snakes that could threaten the nest box. The challenge with these taller baffles is that you have to make them, and you can either do that with the duct pipe from a hardware store and drill a hole into that, or a bollard guard cover and then get a hole saw and drill a hole into that for the pole. In either case, whether a tall or short baffle, your baffle needs to wobble for it to be effective. That gives more instability for a climbing predator. If there are loose cats around, doubling up on predator guards by adding a Noel guard can also help. Cats can jump pretty high, so the baffle may not be enough sometimes. A Noel guard is this cage-like structure that goes around the nest box entrance, and it creates distance between a reaching predator and the entry hole. They're great when paired with a baffle, but on their own, they aren't as broadly protective. There are some other drawbacks to a Noel guard. The main one is that you can't use a Wren guard with them. Wren guards bring me into the topic of competition. When it comes to competition for nest boxes, it's not just that birds are going to fight or bicker. What I didn't realize is that competition happens all the time, and it can get fatal, especially when we're dealing with certain birds. There's native birds and invasive birds. Native competitors are other cavity nesting birds that are native to North America. They've been here forever and have grown alongside their local ecosystem. Native animals play a specific role in their habitat and keep things balanced. But when resources like nesting spots are limited, native birds are all going to compete for the same resource. As tough as this is sometimes for us to watch this, all we can really do is try to manage the peace between our native competing birds and try and help them all thrive. But then there's also the invasive and non-native competition. This type of competition is usually always deadly too. This is where a bird is not native to North America, it didn't grow alongside the ecosystem, and it doesn't have a natural role in the ecosystem. And then they're competing for these resources. They become classified as invasive when they cause ecological or economical harm. When it comes to bluebirds and other cavity birds, the biggest invasive threats come from house sparrows, yeah, the guys you see all the time at McDonald's and everything, and then European starlings, and yeah, you see these guys all the time too. Both regularly fatally attack native birds for their nesting sites. It's not just babies that they go after or eggs. They also attack adults, and it's awful. They pin them in the nest box, and the attacks are pretty gruesome, and it's usually fatal. Another non-native sparrow in the US is the Eurasian tree sparrow. It looks a lot like a house sparrow, and these guys are more aggressive than we once thought. I keep mentioning the description for resources, but if you want some other resources on this topic, I'll have some video links below that you can check out. When I first got started, I do remember hearing warnings about house sparrows, and I just didn't think it would happen. Like, it's not gonna happen to me. Again, it seemed like people were unlucky or overthinking things, but this is the stuff that as a new bluebirder you want to take seriously. And I was definitely wrong. In my first year, house sparrows were all I was getting. So how do you manage all of this competition? Native or non-native? First, I always suggest keeping one extra box on site. So you have one that's set up for your bluebirds, and as soon as something is taking interest in that nest box, then you put up another one. Otherwise, you're going to have two species interested in one box, or three, or more. It just always happens. Next, you can add a sparrow spooker, which is a rack with streamers, and you can add that after the first bluebird egg is laid. And then you can also add a wren guard, which is a hood that hides the nest box hole. And again, you would wait until the first egg is laid, because then your birds are more committed to the nest. And then you take those two guards off when the baby birds are about ready to fledge. They don't always work though, but they do help, especially if you have another nest box that's vacant and open and available. Another thing I want to mention about competition is that if you put up a bluebird box hoping for bluebirds and suddenly you got chickadees or tree swallows, we want to embrace this. It's not just bluebirds that are vulnerable and need our help. All cavity birds really need our help. They're also federally protected, so it's unlawful to remove active nests, so that's a nest with eggs or chicks inside. Believe it or not, it's also not legal to keep bird feathers. You can't keep eggs, you can't keep the birds themselves, you can't keep anything like nests or anything like that, and that's under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Those things are all federally protected. So when you get other native birds nesting in your nest box, you want to protect them too. And again, you can always add another box. For chickadees, to protect them, it's pretty simple. You just add a 1 1/8 inch hole reducer, and then that metal hole guard will prevent some of the other bigger birds from evicting them. And then once your chickadee box is protected, you can set another box out for your bluebirds. And chickadees and bluebirds are mostly good neighbors. For tree swallows, you can just add another nest box. I'd space that about 8 or so feet away from the bluebird box, and they'll get along pretty well that way. Now, when it comes to house sparrows, starlings, and Eurasian tree sparrows, these birds are not federally protected under the Migratory Bird Act. In the state of Illinois, the Eurasian tree sparrow is protected. I don't understand why, but that's the only state that I know that protects that specific non-native sparrow. Missouri does not, I believe Indiana does not. You will have to check with your state and local ordinances, though, about all of these birds if you're thinking about pulling out nests and things like that. But federally, you are able to remove inactive or active nests. They're not protected at all. The really, really hard part about this, and it's something that I didn't know right away until really exploring bluebirds and cavity nesting birds, is that the solutions to deter house sparrows and starlings will only buy you time. Most bluebird landlords are going to tell you to check your local ordinances first and then begin trapping invasive birds. Trapping and what you do after that is a completely different topic. That's a whole other video. I do have a whole playlist that I add videos to on managing invasive birds and how to safely trap. But protecting your bluebirds from invasive competition is one of the hardest parts about getting started with bluebirds. Managing invasive competition brings me to my next point, and that's that one of the easiest ways to reduce both native and invasive competition, and even reduce predator risk that I learned just by getting into it all, is that backyard bird feeding can actually artificially inflate all of these things. So it can draw more predators, more competition to your area. It makes sense too. If you've ever been to a pond when you were a kid and you put a quarter in the little fish or duck food machine, what happens? They all start to come to you. Maybe they were off at a distance and suddenly they see you've got the snacks in your hand. You are mobbed. There is definitely a joy to feeding birds, but as I got more and more into bluebirding, I noticed that raccoons came in the middle of the night. More house sparrows were drawn to the area, even when I changed the seed to safflower and black oil sunflower, or I'd see people posting about how hawks were coming after their birds at the bird feeder. And yes, hawks have to eat too, but we don't want to just be handing our birds over to them on a platter here. Our intentions are really good usually, but sometimes it can skew the balance. Instead, when it comes to feeding, I recommend doing this strategically. If there is extremely hot weather or extremely cold weather, definitely put food out because that will help the birds conserve their energy. If there's been days of rain and you've got a sheltered feeder up, that's perfect, feed them. But come nesting season during periods where it's not extreme weather, if you're working with bluebirds, chickadees, tree swallows, or any other cavity nesting bird, native cavity nesting bird, hold back on bird seed. Just put it out when it's absolutely needed. You're probably a little worried too, because it means that you're not going to see as many birds. And it's true, bird feeders help congregate birds to a given area. But the birds are still out there, and just because you're not putting the feeders out all the time doesn't mean that you have to give up feeding. Instead, plant native plants. These plants provide food and cover to your birds, and they play host to a lot of native insects that some birds, like hummingbirds, absolutely depend on. Plus, bird feeding on native plants makes for some really amazing pictures, and it teaches you so much more about habitat and the role that they play within it. One of the really cool things that I never expected when I got into managing bluebirds is that the very nature of protecting, monitoring, observing, and working with bluebirds and other cavity nesting birds is that you naturally progress as a backyard birder. You go from feeding birds in your backyard to watching their behavior, getting good at identifying other birds, their eggs, the types of nests that they have, and it builds your skills. Soon it's not just cavity birds, you will recognize a Carolina wren nest or a cardinal nest or a robin nest. You'll know the sounds of so many other birds and where to find them too. The natural progression may have you starting to turn your yard more and more into habitat. And then you start to see how the birds interact with their habitat and how they hunt and their quirks of each species. For example, you'll quickly pick up on the fact that house finches, not house sparrows, but house finches, like to follow bluebirds around. And it's not because they're a threat or anything, it's just a really interesting relationship. Usually it's the young house finches, they're really curious and they follow and beg from the bluebird parents. All of this not only makes you just a skilled backyard birder, but it makes your backyard birding really fun by adding so much more dimension to it. The next thing on my list is something that I never expected this to progress into, but it's mentorship and community. When you get into bluebirding and you want to have success, you're going to end up reading articles, watching videos like this, and then you'll find yourself reaching out to people who know a thing or two and you'll be asking them for help. There are a lot of questions that you're probably going to have in your first year, but the cool thing is that bluebird landlords and purple martin landlords, tree swallow landlords, they are all really happy to answer questions and help out because it's to help the birds, and we love the birds. Just by asking questions, you'll start to build your own community and network, and as years go by, you will suddenly find yourself in a position of mentorship, both in person and virtually. One of the things you also may not know when getting into bluebirds is just how much you need to know. And the good news is that you can take your time with this and learn with experience. There's also a lot of resources out there. I mean, this channel for one, but there's a lot of online groups, websites, there's state chapters of the North American Bluebird Society, and there's amazing books out there too. And I'll link a few in the description. Of course, too, I wanted to mention the Bluebird coloring book, which is packed with information about caring for bluebirds. I worked for a year writing and illustrating this book, putting as much information as I could think of for a person who's getting started with bluebirds. So I'll also have that in the description as well, or you can just search for it on Amazon. All of the information and questions you may have can feel like a lot. My advice here is, again, just take it slow, and at the very least, you want to monitor your boxes, prevent predators, and manage competition. Going into this, I did not realize how much, at least over the years anyway, I would spend money-wise on caring for bluebirds. When you first get started, all you really need is a pole, a baffle, and of course your nest box. These supplies can end up running you quite a bit. So before you get into it, start shopping around and see what it's going to cost and if that fits your budget. And you may have to save up a little bit to do things right, but trust me, speaking from experience, you want to take the warnings about predators and protection seriously and just do things right the first time. Then over time, what ends up happening is you will find yourself needing extra supplies like a sparrow spooker, which you can make, or an extra nest box, which means then another pole and another baffle. Then you see people with cameras in their nest box, so then you will want one because it just enhances the whole experience. And then you see some incredible photos that people are taking, and so then you'll want to invest in a nice camera and lens. All of this can happen over years and years and years. And I'd say as far as a hobby goes, the expense isn't terrible. Plus, it's an extremely productive hobby to have because there's a conservation factor involved. The cost over time ends up feeling worth it though when you see the impact that you have. This is another thing that I never expected, or maybe I did, but it's another thing to see it and experience for yourself. When you host bluebirds, one of the really neat things to recognize is that you're actually doing something great for the environment. If you really commit to helping bluebirds, and with that comes all the other native cavity nesting birds, then you can actually feel like you're doing something impactful for nature. What's really neat is that after some years of doing this, you'll see winter flocks in your yard, or you'll look around your neighborhood and see tons of bluebirds and chickadees and tree swallows when before you never saw a single one. And I'm gonna give one of the viewers an anonymous shout out here, but they had mentioned in another video's comment that their HOA is getting involved in monitoring and caring for bluebirds and chickadees. And to me, this was just huge to hear, because not only is one yard in a neighborhood making a difference, but the actual homeowners association is getting involved. So impact can be scaled up, but I'd say don't go crazy in your first year. But if you get into it and you start seeing impact, you could inspire people in your neighborhood or do outreach or just grow it. Okay, I'm gonna walk the excitement back a little bit though, because when you get started, you might put up a nest box and think, if you're lucky enough to get a bluebird or a tree swallow or a chickadee and they choose you, that it's just going to be tons of joy from there. And you might be lucky in your first year to have absolutely nothing go wrong whatsoever. And I really hope that happens for you. But I can say for myself, I have never had a year without tense moments. And I've had some years with heartbreak and mistakes, and there have been complete nest failures. And it really stinks when this happens. When I first got started though, that was my mentality and my fantasy. I was going to get a bluebird and they would have babies and I'd see them fly out of their nest and it would just be so cool. Once things got going and I did things right for the most part, I did experience a lot of that, but I also experienced a lot of heartbreak too. This is another really hard part about hosting cavity nesting birds. Heck, it's hard when you find any bird nest in your yard and you're really excited about it. Maybe you discovered a cardinal nest right outside your window, and then eggs, and then chicks, and then disaster, whether it was a predator or weather or who knows. It's really hard because we get invested emotionally and we're excited to share our yard with these birds and watch them do more than just sing, and we see how they interact with their young and how fast they grow. When something happens and it's all undone, it feels really sad, especially if something happens to a nestling or a parent bird. So heartbreak is just something to be prepared for. And some examples would be like a cowbird gets into your bluebird nest. These are birds that lay their eggs in other birds' nests and then the other species raise their young. The downside is that the baby cowbird ends up crowding out the babies or hogging all the food. Another example is, despite all of your efforts to protect your bluebirds from a house sparrow attack, one still gets in and fatally harms the mother bird or the nestlings or destroys the eggs. We can do our best, but we can only protect them so much. We can't control everything, and that's really hard. These types of tragedies are harder when you first experience them. But then as you understand the wildlife in your yard, you also start to recognize that nature is tough, and it's also just impressive that anything survives. And you also know that another bird will come. It's still sad. I'm not going to say that it's not. It's just that you know the next steps after this happens. Your experience gives you a better game plan, but you're still going to feel sad. The good news is that tragedy doesn't strike all of the time. Most of the time, you're going to do a lot to protect your birds, and it can feel a little stressful sometimes. But as you build experience, these steps that you take to protect your bluebirds often work. And then comes Fledge Day, and it's like a holiday. If you work, you will find yourself hoping that your bluebirds or chickadees fledge on a weekend or a day that you have off, just so you can see it happen. Even with bluebirds having 2 to 4 sets of babies per year during the nesting season, Fledge Day does not get old. I think the reason this can feel like such a big deal is because everything led up to this moment. And if you're new to this and you're wondering what the heck Fledge Day is, this is where a bird takes its first flight out of the nest. For most birds, it's like graduation because that's it. They won't return to the nest after that. Or if they do, it's because they're curious, or if they do, it's because they're building their own nest. But once they fledge, they live in the big world. To make sure that you're able to watch your bluebirds fledge, you want to note the date that they hatch. Hatch day is day 0. Then you would block out days 16 to 18 for eastern bluebirds. That's typically the fledge window. And then, yeah, you just hope that it happens on a day where you have nothing else going on, so you can sit at the window and just enjoy it. There are probably a lot of other things that I wish I'd known when I first started or would love to share, but the good news is that there are so many ways to learn and so many places to ask questions. The Nest Hollow website has a bluebirding resource hub with so much information there. There's even a nest box evaluation checklist to help you research different nest boxes. And then in the description of this video, I will pack it with resources and suggestions and video topics that can all help. And just remember, each year brings more success, and it just becomes absolutely worth it when you see bluebirds increasing as years go by.